Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Melissa Chan.
And I'm Paresh Banerjee.
This week, we will be taking a closer look at Mexico. It is Latin America's second largest economy and the 15th largest economy in the world. To put that in perspective, South Korea's economy ranks 13th globally, and we hear a lot more about South Korea's economy than Mexico's. Politically, of course, it shares a border with the world superpower, the United States. And Washington has been a handful this year. So here at News Desk, we want to talk about how Mexico is engaging with the United States and other key countries it has relations with. Plus, we'll discuss its popular president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and how she's handling not just the tough foreign policy front, but the way she's dealing with the home front. That's why the title of our talk this week is Sheinbaum Showdown: Narcos, Trade and Migration, how Mexico's president navigates a hostile U.S.
And helping us have that discussion will be two experts. One of them is already at the big blue table. Sirajuen Villamar is a Mexican policy analyst. He's based here in Berlin. Welcome to DW News Desk. I think this is the first time you've appeared on News Desk, right?
Yes, it is the first time.
And I hope I got the pronunciation of your name correct. At least halfway correct. Joining us later will also be another expert from Mexico City, it is, right? Alex Gonzalez Ormerod, who's publisher of the Mexico Political Economist. So that's the two experts on Mexico, but we also have an expert in social media who's also in the studio with us. Jared Reed joins us. He'll be talking to you guys in the chat, taking in your questions and comments and helping me with them and bringing them into the discussion. But that's, of course, not the only thing Jared will be doing, because we like to present Jared with a challenge. Therefore, he has a challenge for you in the form of a poll.
Yeah, it's a pretty easy challenge. We've got a poll for you, as usual. This week's question is, what do you think is Mexico's most pressing challenge right now? We've got four options for you. So number one, Donald Trump's trade policies. Fair suggestion. Number two, drugs and organised crime. Number three, corruption. And number four, poverty reduction. So do weigh in on our poll and tell us what you think. Please also do get in touch in the chat and send us your questions and comments. And as Bira said, I'll feed them over to him and he'll put them to our guests today.
And we will also have the result of the poll towards the end of this discussion, but that is a long way off, right, Melissa? So let's talk about the comments that you guys have already posted. And this is in response to the community post that we posted 24 hours in advance of this stream on Tuesday, as we normally do every week. So here's a sample of some of the comments that you guys wrote in with, beginning with this user, at spread awareness -3, a very detailed username, saying, one of the only leaders to stay calm. This president is impressive. Talking about Claudia Sheinbaum, of course. We have another user at MarcoVN8SI. Part of what this user is saying is, she keeps smiling also despite the fact that the country is full of violence, corruption, scandals about her political party. That's something that we intend to go into, right? The domestic politics of what Claudia Sheinbaum is facing. And one other comment from user at SetV0812, part of what this user is saying is, geography matters. Your best trading partners will always be your neighbors. Talking about the United States, naturally. So let us know what you think. The chat is open. Jared and I are waiting for your comments, questions, suggestions.
And if you're just joining us, the topic this week is Mexico. We're entitling this Sheinbaum Showdown: Narcos, Trade and Migration, how Mexico's president navigates a hostile United States. We'll also, of course, be talking about the domestic angle as well. Alrighty, let's just get right into it. I want to bring in our remote guest, Alex Gonzalez Ormerod, who is the publisher, as we mentioned earlier, of the Mexico Political Economist. Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Melissa, lovely to be with you.
And I should tell those of you that are tuning in that I am a reader of the Mexico Political Economist. It's on Substack, and it's a great newsletter I subscribe to that has greatly expanded my knowledge of Mexico. And as a Yankee, as the American, I do feel that the United States and people in the United States tend not to know that much about its neighbor to the south. So for anyone beyond Americans, anyone in the world who wants to better understand Mexico, I highly recommend Alex's Substack. But maybe I should stop talking about Alex's Substack and ask Alex to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
That's enormously kind, Melissa. Thank you. And yes, I really loved what you started with, which is the idea that we hear very little about Mexico, which is strange because I would argue that, at least for the Americans, their most important bilateral relationship on earth is Mexico, by far. And the reason we don't talk much about it is because it works relatively seamlessly. Despite what we're going to talk about today, a lot of what we talk about is actually something that tends to work quite well. Security cooperation, believe it or not, trade, politics. Mexico and the US actually get on quite well, even under Donald Trump. And that, I think, is something worth underscoring as we start. But so much depends on this bilateral relationship.
And can I just come in quickly here? Because you talked about this bilateral relationship, Alex, and one of our regular viewers, Carolina Villenas, is saying that the US and Mexico have like a love and hate relationship. There are times that they've agreed on several issues between both countries as long as they benefit from each other, but mostly, not especially, on immigration policies. Divorce, another regular user, saying, as an American, I'm jealous of Mexico and how they have such a courageous leader. We can delve more into that. And just lastly, Nilay Chaturvedi, another regular viewer of the stream, saying, Sheinbaum has it tough. On the one hand, she is trying to balance assertive sovereignty with pragmatic engagement, but engaging in trade diplomacy to present Mexico as co-equal in North America. Lots to discuss there, Melissa.
Yeah, definitely a lot to discuss. And that is certainly not the narrative that we have. I actually did a search of what else is on the internet. Maybe not a good idea, but I mean, it is important, right? I mean, the digital community, what's on social media is what a lot of people access for news. And the big thing on YouTube, frankly, was whether Trump was going to invade Mexico. That was like the topic of a lot of other podcasts and discussions. And maybe, I know this is kind of almost pithy to ask you guys both about what you think about that narrative. But yes, Trump has said some pretty hard stuff, as he does to many countries. And then now there's the narrative that because of his threats that people are wondering whether the United States will invade Mexico. I think I know the answer to that, but let's just let's answer this and move on from it. But maybe if both of you want to address this whole invasion narrative, that would be fantastic. Zirwan?
Well, thank you. I believe that, let's think, there is a scholar who once said, states are people too. When you start understanding the relation of states as if they were persons, you can also try to give some better explanations. So when you have a leader of a country saying, I hate you, I will invade you, probably this could be also the case of a couple that are, or neighbors, that they feel sometimes a bit stressed, but not necessarily mean it. And when you have a neighbor that is particularly vocal and sometimes quite aggressive, it doesn't mean that it will do it. I will leave it like this way. And of course, you have a president, Mexican president, who is, as someone already mentioned, quite pragmatical. And she finds the way to keep the things cool.
And she also stands up for herself. Alex, before we go to you to comment on that, why don't we play a soundbite from the leader of Mexico, because I think it is indicative of just kind of what personality she is.
Mexico is not subordinate to anyone. We're a free, sovereign, and independent nation. We coordinate and collaborate. We've said it many times, but we're not subordinate. Mexico is a great country, and our relationship with the United States must be one of equals, not of subordination. We are nobody's piñata.
No somos piñata de nadie.
We are nobody's piñata. And just in case,
What is a piñata? Yeah.
what is a piñata? I feel really weird explaining it. Maybe I should have either of you guys explain it. But hey, we have them in California as well. They are paper mache, sort of animals or whatever mascots that are fun, and you hit it with a bat or a stick until candy comes out. It's a big part of parties and stuff like that. So her reference to piñatas, just in case you're somewhere in the world where you don't know what that is.
I have an image of a piñata in case you'd like to sort of put this up on my shared computer.
Let's do that.
It's just an example of...
but the point being that she won't be hit around or messed around with. And maybe with that, as the image of the piñata comes up, Alex, I don't know if you want to comment on some of this narrative about the invasion and whether it's going to be happening, because there are people who don't know a lot who really are wondering if something like that would happen.
The United States, I think, is in an enormous disadvantage when it comes to negotiating with Mexico on one very important front, which is the United States tends to not care much about Mexico because the relationship sort of flows, and it cares about a lot of the rest of the world. Mexico cares almost exclusively about the United States, which is a problem in itself, but it means that Mexican politicians, policymakers, and business people are incredibly well-versed about American, like municipal politics, the different issues going on inside the United States. And so it's not just Claudia Sheinbaum who's named her policy the cool heads policy, where she comes in and she understands how important the relationship is, and therefore her job is to communicate it to the United States. And that really has traditionally been the job of Mexicans, which is to get them to understand Mexico, because that's a massive issue. Ignorance. What's interesting to me is the degree to which they've succeeded, because I've never seen a tweet like the one we saw a few weeks ago when Trump delayed the tariffs on Mexico. It sounded like an old-fashioned statesman. He sounded measured, balanced. He acknowledged the complexities of the relationship. And I'm like, wow, they've done a really good job at making the most hyperbolic man on earth understand that actually you can't tweet your way out of this particular negotiation. And you can see that in the negotiations on security, trade, and drugs.
Let's talk about those negotiations. I mean, the U.S. has complained about trade with Mexico, and you've talked about how they've delayed it in terms of the tariffs. It'll be a challenge to see what happens next, but also the flow of drugs from Mexico to the United States and also the border issue. What's the view from the Mexican side? I mean, does the U.S. have valid points in its list of grievances? I'm thinking particularly of something that I read recently, that Sheinbaum has arrested more drug cartel members than her predecessor. She's only 1/3 of the way or something like that into her presidency. A sixth, yes, you're right. Thank you. And so she's arrested about 30,000 members, and that's more than AMLO, her predecessor, and Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador did during his entire 6-year tenure combined. It looks like from my perspective, just reading that, it looks like the U.S. put pressure and Mexico acted on it, which implies that Mexico could have done more all these years. And if it hadn't been for this sort of harsh rhetoric from Trump, we wouldn't be getting the results of that. And I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate, but I would love for both of you to comment on that. Zerohan, you've got a look on your face, please.
Well, yes, the first thing is Mexico has grievances as well. So let's think not only on the side of why is the U.S. saying we are claiming that you are doing this and that. Mexico could always also say what is happening with the weapons, the flow of weapons that is coming from the U.S. and then arriving to Mexico and being used for the cartel activities and killing most of the people. No, these U.S. Weapons. So that would be one thing. And the other is at the beginning of September, Marco Rubio, State Secretary, visited Mexico City. He had a lot of high-level meetings. And in one press conference, he said, we recognize Mexico is our best ally. We are being cooperating with Mexico in a wide array of matters, and it is the most cooperative ally or partner. So this means that I'm absolutely sure. We, as Mexicans, we are doing the best we could, trying to also provide certainty for our people, for our country, for our sovereignty.
Can I just pick up on that one point that you made? I did not know that this was also one of those grievances from the Mexican side in terms of the flow of weapons, for example, that goes to cartels that the government is now cracking down on. So if this is a point of concern for the Mexican government, why has the government not been more forceful about this for the US to take action on? Is it because, to use Donald Trump's language, Mexico doesn't have as many cards as the US has when it comes to these kind of negotiations?
And I do know that Sheinbaum has raised this directly on a phone call with President Trump.
Exactly. No. Yes, Alex?
I would quite forcefully point out that actually Mexico has been incredibly active. The Mexican government sued American arms companies. It was a massive lawsuit. It was more of a bit for show, but it was a really big deal because they took it to the highest courts in the land. And it was a strategy to really underscore how important this issue is. If anything, most Mexican governments are very good at negotiating with the US, but this particular government has had a great success in the form of having the United States government recognize, probably for the first time, the co-responsibility of who they are in this sort of like game. They provide the market for the drugs with billions of dollars in revenue for cartels, and they provide the arms for the drugs with billions of dollars worth of high-grade weapons coming into Mexico. I mean, what's interesting about this terrorist naming that they've just done with the cartels, just for context, they've named terrorists, they've named cartels terrorists. What's interesting to me is how Americans deal with it, because that would make arms salespeople and a lot of other folks in the United States terrorist sympathizers.
Subjects of.
And then, so I do want to go back then. What is driving Sheinbaum's arrest of so many cartel members compared to her predecessor?
So important to underscore another thing, which is arrests don't equal solving the issue. What we've seen throughout the decades-long drugs war is that different attempts at solving the issue have been tried with mixed results. The issue is cartels aren't a sort of singular monolith. They adapt. There are many different sorts of cartels. Some are more violent than others. Some are more corrupt than others. Some are more diversified than others. Some aren't even in drugs mainly. Some of them live from extortion, and therefore when you buy limes or whatever, that can sometimes be linked to organized crime. What's interesting to me is the previous government's approach wasn't so much about arrests, because it was basically a different tack. They said, what happens if we don't go out guns a-blazing like the previous administrations, killing a bunch of people and then actually just making violence worse? The answer was, it wasn't very effective. Claudia Sheinbaum is doing something different, which I think is probably the most promising approach to this problem for many years, which is, instead of going out guns a-blazing, it's all based on intelligence. It's an intelligence-based approach to arrests in which you don't only hunt down people who can be easily replaced, but you cut off sources of money, and you approach this issue in a holistic way rather than just killing people, which has historically been a disaster for Mexico, and a strategy that has been pushed by the US government to terrible bloodshed in the country.
Yeah, I would like simply to add that in this year, since February, Mexico has delivered to the U.S. 55 criminals. This you could call the most wanted from the U.S. perspective, and they were sent in the accelerated procedures. No, so there is a clear cooperation stance from the Mexican government.
What was the thinking of the previous administration not to do something like that?
I don't know. I would say maybe there was a different impression. We have our own definition of sovereignty, very classical, but this government is quite more pragmatical. And this doesn't mean that the Mexican government is giving up sovereignty. It's simply saying, if you demand this, here you have.
Alex, would you agree with that? It was previously about sovereignty, and now they're willing to cooperate and doesn't see it so much as a pride matter.
one of the big things that Donald Trump did was he eliminated a previous way of doing negotiations, which is he's combined all issues. Before they had a separate track negotiation style, the Americans. So trade was different from security, which was different from other issues. Now it's all mixed in, which actually I think gives a lot of cards to Mexico, because Mexico might be in a weak position when it comes to, say, trade, but it's in a very strong position when it comes to limiting migration and handing over literally gifts. And Americans love it. You hand over all these people, alleged criminals, and you make the Americans very happy, and therefore they might be more likely to be more lenient when it comes to trade. It sounds obvious to us, but it's actually quite a different way of negotiating on the world stage.
Am I hearing so far, about 15, 20 minutes into this conversation, am I hearing that actually the Trump administration is doing some very interesting and productive things that the Mexican government side feels is quite refreshing and productive?
It's hard to say so like this, but I believe both are trying to be constructive.
And at this point, let's just, since Sheinbaum had her voice, let's also run a soundbite from President Donald Trump that is not about threats of invasion, but is far more conciliatory and also aligns very well with this relationship, this improved relationship in certain aspects that we've been talking about just now.
And I spoke to the President of Mexico, a wonderful woman, today, and we helped them out with the problem they were having to do with the tariffs, short-term tariffs. And we had a very good conversation. Also, we discussed drugs, and they've been working much harder lately. Do you notice that? On people coming in and drugs, and we've made tremendous progress on both.
Is a lot of Trump's pressure helps the Mexican government do politically sensitive stuff that they usually wouldn't be able to do in Mexico. Sometimes quite worrying stuff. The creation of this intelligence apparatus does imply the breach of a lot of privacy for everyday citizens. It's basically the construction of we'll call it a soft surveillance state, but that's very much justified on the basis of the Americans are forcing us to do it. Whereas I think really this is what Claudia Sheinbaum would have wanted to do anyway. And then I think there's the fact that Americans, and especially Donald Trump, he needs to talk tough about how he's forcing the Mexicans to do stuff. But actually, the cooperation is incredibly intense. Mexico can't do stuff, a lot of the stuff it wants to do without the United States when it comes to security. A lot of the drug laundering money, a lot of the money laundering for drugs happens in the United States. And so you can't fix the issue without all the criminal enterprises working stateside.
Can I just bring in a point here, Alex, from one of our viewers, Neela Chaturvedi, in terms of drug trafficking? Is the point that he makes, rather cautions, is in terms of drug trafficking, Mexico will have to toe a thin line cooperating with the US, not just for America, but for its own law and order stake, but preventing US from treating it as one of its own states. Is there a danger here that Donald Trump, seeing that all these gifts, as I think you put it, Alex, coming from Mexico, that the Americans start believing and Donald Trump starts believing that Mexico basically does what you ask it to do?
Well, it's an interesting question. Of course, I wouldn't say Mexico is not aware of this possibility in case of they are trying to understand the way he works and offering some of the things the US or the president demands. But also I believe from the Mexican side, the calculation is the US is a strong country with strong institutions, despite many things we have seen. And the term of the President Trump administration will come to an end. So we will have to continue our relation with the US without the President Trump. So we will have to be able to negotiate now, maybe to cede a lot of things, but also on the other hand, we will have a long-term relation. Because as someone said already, this is geography. We cannot simply cut the continent.
And we spent a lot of time talking about drugs. I just want to touch now spend a little bit of time talking about the border and the tariffs. You know, Mexico has sent about 10,000 National Guards of their own to the border. And that, again, the narrative in the United States has been reported as in response to pressure from President Trump. But again, I would like to hear the Mexican point of view on why that is happening right now. Is it primarily because of American pressure? Alex? Or?
This is a very clever
Yeah.
This is a very clever strategy because it's really convenient for both Trump and Sheinbaum to say it's because Americans made us do this politically in Mexico, because it's the deployment for migratory issues of a military force. That's not popular amongst at least the critical opposition of the government. But if you say Trump forced us, you really have no choice. But this is very much in line to what the Mexican government was doing anyway when it came to migration, because one of the great cards Mexico has in its hand is the control of the flow of migrants. You need to remember that Mexican migration, the migration of Mexicans to the United States, has been negative, as in Mexicans coming back to Mexico for the past decade or so. What has been happening, the big change, is the flow of migrants from every other country in the world, from Russians to Chinese to Latin Americans, coming through Mexico to reach the United States. And so the use of a militarized National Guard to stop migrants is a very contentious issue. It violates a lot of these migrants' human rights, but it's incredibly politically beneficial for Claudia Sheinbaum, because it allows her to show Trump, look what I'm doing, this is all for you, basically, even though that was already what they were doing, even from the Biden administration.
I subscribe what Alex said.
Let's then move on, since the border thing, I think, let's keep it simple. Let's talk about the tariffs, which is a lot messier. What's the worst case scenario that could happen with the tariffs in regards to the United States? It's been delayed, but it can't be delayed indefinitely, or can it?
It can be delayed indefinitely. I mean, we know that this is clearly not under any existing agreement, not even in WTO, clearly not under the NAFTA 2.0. So it is possible. What is the worst case scenario? That the US starts imposing or increase the tariffs, or simply said, we will put a automatic or a clear stop, no? So that would be the worst case scenario. This is already analyzed by many people in the US and Mexico and Canada, saying this will have huge costs for the people. This will be reflecting in inflation.
But that doesn't seem to impact President Trump's attitude on tariffs with a lot of other countries. Alex, before I go to you, I just want to quickly just pull up a graphic we have so people have an understanding of the trade relationship between the two countries. Over 80% of Mexico's exports went to the United States. Inversely, U.S. exports to Mexico represent about almost 16% of all its exports, and Mexico is the biggest single exporter, though, to the United States, ahead of China. And actually, for many years, it was China that was the largest exporter to the United States. And I think about 2 years ago was when Mexico overtook that. We will talk about China later, but just briefly, Alex, what's your observations on the potential tariffs, if there are any? I know that he has slapped some figure on, but it doesn't look like it's happening. It's been delayed, but maybe it won't be delayed and he'll change his mind. Like, what's going on? What do we expect there?
So basically, this graph is very useful for people to see the scale of the trade, but it hides a really important fact, which is trade isn't the same trade all around the world. Trade coming in from China into Mexico, into the US, tends to be finished products, no added value, undercutting American industry. Trade from Mexico into the United States is complementary. And so to slap tariffs on Canada and Mexico after 30 years of integrating their economies is literally to slap a tariff on US industry. It's the opposite of protectionism, because what Mexico does is it makes the uncompetitive parts of American industry competitive again. So if you slap a tariff on Mexican auto parts, you're not subsidizing American auto parts, what you're doing is you're making American cars far less competitive, far more expensive, and therefore less attractive to consumers, therefore reducing the amount people want to buy those cars. That's what tariffs do. And I think Donald Trump understands this, because as opposed to every other country, so Brazil, for example, slightly bigger economy than Mexico's, but far less integrated in the US, they say, well, we know we'll just slap on some coffee and slap on some tariffs, and then coffee will go up slightly, and then the liberals in New York won't be able to have their flat whites. Whereas you slap tariffs on Mexican beer, for example, which seems a pretty uncomplex product, suddenly you slap taxes on almost all of your Republican states in the heart of America, because guess who the Americans' biggest export partner is for barley and all the stuff you need to make beer? It's Mexico.
If I could simply add to what Alex was saying, in both cases, what is the main product or branch of products that Mexico is exporting and importing from US is car industry. So this has a clear name. These are the 5, 6 large makers, plus a huge chain of 3,000, 50,000, I don't know the number, of companies producing parts for autos. So it is absolutely clear that is a very bad decision, no, to put this. And also the Mexican Ministry of Economics has some studies saying there are some auto parts that cross the border
multiple
7
times
to 9 times. Just imagine that.
There is a question from one of our viewers, Nila, especially on this export dependence, if you like, on the US market. Nila is asking, don't you believe that Mexico's clear priority, therefore, should be to reduce export dependence on the US market, for that is a permanent lever that will be pulled against them? What do you think?
That is already it's already thought in Mexico, and the Mexican government also implemented in parallel something called Plan Mexico, the Mexican plan, which the main goal of this is to diversify our trade partners around the world, and secondly, also to strengthen the national market, the internal market.
Well, on that note, you've created the perfect segue to talk about the Mexico-Canada meeting that happened, I believe, last week, when Sheinbaum met with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. And there's been a lot of shuttling between these two countries at the cabinet level as well. Optically, again, being in the United States, it looks like it's a strategy from the two countries to mitigate the instability coming from the United States. Is that a correct interpretation of the meeting? And what is the relationship between Canada and Mexico? Because looking at the trade figures, they actually don't trade with each other very much. This trilateral relationship is very Canada-US, Mexico-US, and not Mexico with Canada.
Well, that is... Sorry, Alex, you go.
One of the interesting things that people often forget, including Doug Ford and the Premier of Alberta, who attacked Mexico early on to cozy up to Trump, to no avail, by the way, they forget that Mexico was the country that invited Canada back in the 90s to join what was then the precursor to the USMCA, NAFTA. And it was they were deliberately invited to counterbalance the US. Decades later, what do we have? Something completely different. As you well say, Mexico only exports about 3% of its exports to Canada versus 80% with the US. And by the way, Canada's number 2. What does that mean? It means the USMCA and NAFTA before that have been tools for integration, but of dependency on the US. Again, right, the figures sort of hide what's really going on, because what actually has happened is Mexican industry and Canadian industry have integrated, but through the United States. And what these talks are about is about trying to start to diversify with each other directly. But it turns out it's enormously difficult because there has been no policy for it. The USMCA assumed that everything would work out if you just let the free market work. And now we're in this terrible situation of dependency. What the Canada-Mexico talks are actually about industrial policy and states driving trade flows in ways that are artificial. What that means is actually better for diversification in order for Mexico and Canada to start actually exchanging. But the talks are so early, like so early days, that when we wrote about this in the Mexico Political Economist earlier this week, what we saw was basically everything is a plan to have a plan, which is pretty early days.
I mean, there's also the fact that there is a massive landmass in the way between Canada and Mexico that would be an impediment for trading directly with each other. They'd have to go through the United States or go along the coast somewhere or the other. So that makes it harder. But Zidoan, you had some thoughts on this as well.
Yes, I was to say that let's think a bit of the U.S. a little bit like stars. So they have a big mass, and the larger the mass of a star is, they can even become a black hole. And that brings all energy. That is concentrating everything. But this also happens in other free trade agreements around the world. There are players that are larger, and of course they have a larger take or ratio in this economic relation. Regarding what Alex was saying, the Mexican plan, the Plan Mexico, it has also a little bit of this entrepreneurial state that Mariana Mazzucato is talking about. We need to have a industrial policy that simply the government, in the previous governments in Mexico, decided to leave to the market. And this current situation with the current U.S. administration is also helping other countries, Mexico among them, to decide what is better for them. Maybe it's also a wake-up call to say we have some measures, there are some instruments we can make use of.
Great. I don't know which order to talk about it, but I do want to talk about the EU and Mexico, but why don't we talk about China? I don't know, and it seems that it has the second largest influence on Mexico after the United States in many ways. And of course, China is nowhere near the American continent. And the trading relationship Mexico has with China is also pretty complex. There are benefits and also drawbacks. And I understand that the government is contemplating tariffs on China on certain goods. I'm not quite sure where that is and where that stands.
They've already happened.
Already happened. Okay. I'd love for the both of you to talk about that weird trilateral dance that happens between Mexico, China, and the United States, because it is coming up. It also comes up in the drug context because the Americans blame the Chinese for fentanyl production, and then they also blame the Mexicans for moving the fentanyl through from China into the United States. So there's this trilateral thing going on, and I'm going to keep it pretty open-ended how you guys want to tackle this. Let's start with Alex.
China is an interesting country for Mexico because it looms much bigger in the imaginations of the Americans. This theory that it's a backdoor Mexico through which Chinese drugs and goods can flow. Turns out that's categorically untrue when it comes to trade, and it's categorically a trilateral problem when it comes to the drugs. What's interesting to me is that when we talk about Chinese influence in Mexico, actually, Mexico has done really well at staving it off, given the size of China, given the fact that Mexico's China's real first victim. Everything Donald Trump is complaining about the Chinese undercutting American industry, was something that Mexico was forced to do and to experience in the early 2000s when China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization. What's interesting is no one really cared back then because it was just little old Mexico and they're unproductive. But now that they're nipping at the Americans' heels, now suddenly it's unfair. So you can really see the imbalances even in the narratives that we have, where when Mexico can't keep up, it's because it's too slow. When America can't keep up, it's because it's all unfair and the system's cheating. The truth is, though, Mexico does have a far finer balance with China than with the US. With the US, it tends to be an issue of political posturing, but actually a lot of the goals are aligned between Mexico and the United States. When it comes to China, there does have to be a balance between how much you remain friends with China, which Mexico does want to remain, whilst protecting your own industry, because there still is a lot of undercutting going on. And Mexico, therefore, has slapped tariffs on clothes, has slapped tariffs on shoes, on a bunch of stuff that comes to China, which undercuts Mexican industry, but also violates the law, doesn't pay tariffs, it sneaks around the border. that sort of thing that Americans tend to complain about is what's happening in Mexico. And again, right, this is an economic issue, but it's also very much linked to security, because when you sneak products in, even though they're shoes, you could also be sneaking in the precursors and fentanyl itself. So it's about security just as much as it is about trade.
I would like to add to these two dimensions a third one, that is the big global power shift. So what we are seeing here is not a trouble between two medium-sized countries and a little one. We are seeing two superpowers in a global strategic rivalry. And what is the role of Mexico in this? So Mexico is trying to play its cards the best way it can, knowing, of course, that our economy is particularly depending to the US, and knowing as well that a Mexican population living in the US can, depending on the way you measure it, but can be the 10 million, 11 million Mexicans first generation, up to 35 million, including the second and third generation living there. So what is the priority? And in this rivalry, Mexico is trying to find its way out.
Can I just comment on the point on China? Because Carolina Velina, another one of our viewers, very engaged chat, I must say, lots of comments. She's talking about China being one of the biggest trading and economic partners in the world, can't live without them. And therefore, my question to you, Sira, you talked about the Mexican plan earlier. Does this involve Mexico diversifying in any way to China, or is it just a matter of trying to prevent goods coming in and undercutting Mexican?
No, it's diversifying in every possible way, particularly to reduce the dependency to the US.
Correct.
But if you think of China, I would also think of Brazil. Just also 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, there was a huge delegation of Brazilian government and entrepreneurs bringing ideas of we need to strengthen our trade as immediately as possible. Mm-hmm. No? So it is not only a thing, I believe we shouldn't see it or we shouldn't read it as a either one or the other. There are many other places in the world with economic partners we could trade with.
Alex, I heard
story,
you. Yes, come on in.
The story of China is unique in the story of the history of the world, really, what we're seeing right now, because we've never seen something quite like it, and we need to understand it before we start seeing whether we want to diversify towards China or receive investment from them. There's something fascinating going on right now, which is because internal domestic growth has stalled in China, which is usually where it was the sink for consumption for a lot of their industrial capacity, they're now exporting it. And that exportation means incredibly subsidized products that are very good at very cheap prices that are being flooded into the rest of the world. Hooray, say consumers, but it's a disaster for local manufacturing. And so you can do one of two things. If you have no industry, like a lot of Africa, some parts of Southeast Asia, and some parts of Latin America, you can just open your doors and get cheap goods and then never industrialize. It's almost impossible for you to industrialize once you've had that flood of very muscular like overcapacity from industrial China. Industrialized countries like Mexico, like Brazil, have to take a different tack. And despite all this BRICS solidarity that we hear about from China, Russia, India, and Brazil, all these countries are actually slapping tariffs on China because they understand this. There's an 80% tariff on Chinese cars from Russia, which is at war and is technically completely blocked by the rest of the West. So imagine how powerful this phenomenon is, where you've got tariffs being slapped all around the industrial world against China, not because they dislike the Chinese, not because they're particularly aligned with the US, but because it undercuts their industry. That's the same case in Mexico. The decision's slightly easier because we're so integrated. As I said, in the same way that we're integrated with the US in the sense that we give each other value, we make each other more competitive, it's the opposite case when it comes to Chinese investment. They were talking about a BYD factory here in Mexico, and it got cancelled. And I'd say luckily, because as opposed to the Mexico-US car manufacturing ecosystem where Mexicans make parts or glass, and then that gets put into the car, and a lot of value is generated in Mexico, not enough, but quite a lot. That would not be the case with a Chinese car factory. It would be an assembly factory where all the parts, including the steel sometimes, like the primary goods, would be imported from China, assembled here at pennies, and then sold to undercut the whole auto industry in the country. So it's important to consider when you're diversifying your investments and your trade, whether that trade is good and fair trade or a good and fair investment. Not all investments are maybe.
It's very interesting. You talk about Brazil and Mexico needing to worry about the flood of Chinese goods. But of course, here in Germany, that is another big topic as well. And actually, it is another great, perfect segue into what you spend a lot of time studying, Zerohan, which is looking at the Mexico relationship with Europe and the EU. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about that. I know absolutely nothing about how that bilateral relationship and negotiations and talks are going.
Well, Mexico has a free trade agreement. We call it global agreement because it's not only about trade and investment, it's also about political cooperation and political dialogue and development cooperation. Clearly, the amount of trade between Mexico and the European Union is way smaller compared to the one to the US. Our main trade partner in the European Union is Germany. And in this case, just to give an example, so the Mexican exports to the US are 83% last year, and to Germany, it was 1.25%.
Wow.
So just to give an impression.
There's potential of expansion.
Plenty. And,
Putting it mildly.
Exactly. And in the case of the Mexican-US relation, Mexico has a surplus, but in the case of Mexico, Germany, we have a deficit. But this is quite normal with countries and vis-a-vis Germany. No? So we have a free trade agreement since 2000, following the example of the good practice of NAFTA in 1994. Mexico and the EU have declared at the beginning of this year, we finished our negotiation. We are now looking forward to sign the document. And after signing the document comes the ratification process, which is, from the Mexican side, quite easy. The Mexican government has enough votes in the Chamber, in the Senate, to ratify it. But in the case of European Union countries, these are 27. And in the case, I believe, of Belgium, there's even a subnational level that have to be ratified in two different chambers. So it's really difficult. It's challenging, but we have to take this step.
But certainly there's a greater urgency now from both sides, understanding that they need to really diversify their dependence away from the United States.
I mean, yesterday at the framework, as a side event in New York at the General Assembly, the EU, Brazil, India, and Mexico ministers of foreign affairs gather there, and they say we need to continue or strengthen our relations in trade and cooperation in multilateral affairs. It's clear for everyone.
And yet, what's fascinating about this conversation is that we say we've got to diversify, let's have more trade with Europe. One of the big sort of like innovations of this updated EU-Mexico free trade agreement was the export of Mexican pork to the EU, until you realize, of course, that Mexican pork is economically viable because of the enormous amounts of feed we import from the United States. So when we export more pork to Europe, we're actually depending more on the US. And so that's how ingrained the global economy ultimately is. Everyone talks about the end of globalization and regionalization, and that is true. But I think that undercuts how much we're completely integrated at this point.
That is very interesting, and I'm just looking at the time and realizing we need to move on to talk a little bit about the domestic challenges of Mexico, as we're going to completely miss that. So if you're just joining us, we have been talking about Mexico. The title of the discussion is Sheinbaum Showdown, Narcos, Trade, and Migration, how Mexico's president navigates a hostile U.S. But now we are moving on to talk about the domestic angle. But before we do that, very quickly, Jared, have you been looking at chat? Can you tell us a little bit about some of your takeaways so far?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interest on trade at the moment and all this talk about diversification. And that was a really good point that Alex just made about, the flow-on effects of for example, exporting more pork to Europe means that Mexico is more dependent on the US and what all of that means. Everyone's really, really interested in these types of topics, particularly how also you said how Mexico is trying to play its cards between the US and China. Lots of questions about China as well. But as we move on to the domestic issues, Yenziman T is wanting to know what Sheinbaum's approval ratings are in Mexico. Can anyone tell him what they are? And I guess we'll get to that in just a moment, probably.
Jared, you set that up so nicely for me that I didn't need to do another segue. Let's go right into it.
Sure.
It's very high.
It's very high. I believe the last...
We can show some polls. I mean,
Okay,
you can
yeah,
keep talking.
have them.
I mean,
But
we have
I remember by El País, it was right below 80%.
Yeah, I mean, this is like what we're seeing here on our screens right now is basically across 3 different polls. The green is obviously for the approval rating for Claudia Sheinbaum, and it ranges from 70% to 74 to 79%. So a very high approval rating. And just for comparison, 67% was the approval rating for the ex-president, the one who preceded her, AMLO Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, after 11 months in office. So a big difference between 67% there for the previous president and 79% from at least one of the other polls. Let's just expand on this a bit more, because there are lots of, we can maybe stick a link for this survey in the chat, so people can sort of explore this at their own time. But there was also this general question of, let me come down to it. Where am I going? Yeah, in general, if you approve or disapprove of Claudia Sheinbaum's job as president of Mexico, and there is a gendered division there of how people look at the job that she has done. And amongst women, there was an 80% approval rating for Claudia Sheinbaum as president, and amongst men, 78%. And I wondered if that is unique in terms of almost being matched between men and women in terms of approval. And if you look at it across different age groups, there is, again, it's generally above 70%.
That's super high for any leader in the democratic world.
1/6 the way through her presidency. And this is something that you were pointing out, Melissa, as well. Like, the biggest accomplishment that they see during her presidency so far is the social assistance that her government is giving out. This is basically welfare payments to the poor and marginalized, something that began with the previous president. Although relations with Donald Trump figure very low at only about 4%, at least domestically, in Mexico. So there's some interesting statistics there. But in terms of approval ratings in the high 70s.
Well, I believe that one thing that we shouldn't forget is that she's the first female president of Mexico. This has a huge impact. Sorry?
Why don't you finish your thought, and then Alex can maybe come in after that.
Sorry. Yeah, then in that case, I believe that has a huge impact. And she's still making good use of this opportunity. No? I would also say the case of poverty reduction, it is, we have no yet statistics about how has been the success with her, because she has only been 1 year in office, but with the previous government. So this also is seen, I believe, by the Mexican people as following a tradition, and good results from previous administration is also providing some basis for this approval.
I'm glad we can have a bit of disagreement here, because we've been agreeing most of the time. But I would say that her being a woman president is incredibly historic. She's made a very big deal out of it, rightly so. But it's something that the media and international elites tend to focus on mostly. I think this is something that the left can learn from all over the world, which is, if you focus on identity politics, you will not win. You can see it. I love that you brought up the gender divide. There is no real gender divide between men and women's approval rating of Claudia Sheinbaum. And the reason is, her Morena government, Morena being the party in power, her party, which was her predecessors, have focused almost exclusively on the material, on the fact that people have a cost of living crisis, a salary crisis, a poverty crisis, and they've honed in on that. Even her feminist policies, so to speak, have a working class component. It's for working class women. It's for indigenous women. And that to me is fundamental to the way that this government approaches social issues. It's all on the basis of the economy. And so you can see the social programs, the doubling of the minimum wage. That is what categorically keeps Claudia Sheinbaum way up in the polls. I'd say she couches it in feminist language because she truly believes in it, and she has moved her policy towards a more feminist direction. But I think overall, the fact that she's a woman is not particularly useful when you want to explain her popularity, especially when you compare it, the conservative and liberal opinion diverging in the rest of the world, in the democratic world, being divided between men and women. That's not something you're seeing in Mexico. I know it wasn't completely disagreeing, but I know we want the clickbait to thrive here, so we can get a lot of comments on the social media platform.
Well, but she does lean into that sort of vibe. I know that Baresh was looking at her social media account. If you want to share some of the stuff, if you look at her stuff.
One particular video, right? I mean, this is, maybe we can just share this, share my computer and just sort of show this. I mean, you were saying that there is not much of a difference, and the polls sort of show that, no difference between the men and women in terms of popularity. But you look at these images, this is from her YouTube channel, surrounded by women, the center of attention of women, and you're greeting them, and you were talking about feminist foreign policy. So there really is this push towards making her a populist leader, if you like, and really trying to play on her popularity with women. And I wonder how much of a role that actually plays when it comes to her overall popularity. This is for anybody who wants to answer that.
I do believe it plays a role. I do believe it plays a role, no doubt.
Okay. Alex, you were saying?
I think the stats show it. The stats show it. As you well showed, the fact that men and women have the same perspective on her, relatively speaking, and the fact that where the economic policies have succeeded, there is a much greater respect for Claudia Sheinbaum. I mean, it's really important to separate politicians' narratives from what makes them popular or unpopular. I think you can see that all over the world, right? You can see that with the current Republican administration in the US giving massive tax cuts to the rich in their policy, but in fact, talking about how they're bringing back jobs to the United States when that's clearly not the case. I think narratives are really important to politicians, but what makes Claudia Sheinbaum popular, the statistics show this across the board, is not the fact that she's pushing the fact that she's a woman and the feminism. It's the material change that her government and her predecessor's government have brought to the table.
And it almost seems as if she is leaning in on the feminist message, but it is not turning off the male population and demographic, which is very interesting because there's always that issue with any female politician in a democratic society. Okay, we've been so positive. What are the issues? Early on, about half an hour ago, Alex, you did touch on the fact that she kind of already wanted this surveillance when it came to the war on drugs, and that her predecessor was certainly had his critics in terms of his shift ever so slightly on certain things that very many people considered anti-democratic. So, Alex, I'm going to let you sort of get started on this one. And of course, there's also the judicial thing too, right? The elections a couple of months ago that went ahead. That was also something from her predecessor. So talk about whatever you'd like to talk about with this panoply of things you can discuss.
Yeah. The Morena government, and I think this is Claudia Sheinbaum, but also the apparatus that brought her to power, is a problematic government when it comes to politics and democracy, because I think a lot of their critics come in and say, oh, democracy's dead because look at how they're governing the country, they're sort of steamrolling everyone. But the issue is they have supermajorities, they have enormous popularity, there is no opposition to speak of in Mexico, and therefore they're governing as literally any other party would govern, with far less of a mandate, if I'm honest. I mean, we talk about Donald Trump steamrolling American politics right now, and he's barely got a majority in either House of Congress. So, like, to be honest, I think there is a mandate for big change in Mexico. The great issue is, I think, how much this supermajority and the amount of power the government has accumulated has blinded them to debate and to sensible criticisms of their policies. There are lots of issues with a lot of the policies they've instituted that I think I can understand why they've instituted it. The surveillance state is a very good example where they clearly do need to make security better in Mexico. And if Mexicans have to give up a bit of their freedom, well, so be it. And I think a lot of Mexicans, like we've seen in El Salvador under Nayib Bukele's crackdown, very draconian. Mexico's is far more democratic than that. But there's still a lot to debate that isn't being debated because they can just steamroll over any criticism and any opposition. And I think that's the interesting and delicate balance between this conversation that we hear abroad about Mexico ceasing to be democratic. Mexico, I think, is far more democratic than a lot of Western nations that we see today that tend to have that little badge of being the best democracies on earth. But it does have a lot of issues that do need to be spoken about.
I just want to sort of come in here because Carolina Villena is making a point to you, Melissa, because she's asking, based on your thoughts, it seems that she's the female version of Duterte, the one who's been charged, the former Philippines leader who's been charged by the ICC for crimes against humanity. It's crimes against humanity, isn't it, that he's been charged for? So would you think that that Sheinbaum is the female version of Duterte?
Well, I clearly would say radically no. But I would like to go back to the point of some other downsides of this, the current situation in Mexico. And I believe it's because we spoke about economics, it's about economic growth. This is the big trouble of Mexico. IMF just announced last week or this week that their prognosis that Mexican GDP will grow this year 1%. That is not enough. It's not great. The amount of necessities of the country is so big that you need to have economic activity, dynamic, in order to be able then to continue providing, if you want to call it social services and transactions to the people, money transfers to the people. You need to have a growing economy. But of course, this is I would say, a combination of two factors, domestic and external. And external is clearly a turmoil.
And then, of course, there's also the possibility of inflation. And how's that playing a role? I mean, you might double the minimum wage, but if inflation is going up as well, that cuts into it.
Fortunately, that was one of the good lessons last year, that we saw how at the end of the government of President López Obrador, this hypothesis that if we increase salaries, inflation will rocket, it didn't happen. So in this case, inflation is more or less under control. No, but what we need is to grow.
Alex?
This is a really important point that you've brought up, Melissa, because I think it's the part of the Mexican industrial policy that people don't really talk about because it's not as sexy as doubling the minimum wage, but it's essential and it's multifaceted. A lot of Plan Mexico is a lot of import substitution, but it's about self-sustainability and providing what Mexicans need. Inflation hasn't gone up because there have been conversations with the private sector, and where the private sector won't budge or can't do much, the state steps in. And so, for example, there are agreements to cap prices of oil, of gas in Mexico. That's a private-public agreement that Mexico can lean in on because it is a massive player in the oil scene in Mexico. When it comes to basic goods, the Mexican government says, well, let's come to a deal with the tortilla makers, and they have a nice chat with them. And if it's a segmented section of the economy or it's foreign companies, they replace that. So from chocolate to instant coffee, the Mexican government is rolling in to start their own factories to assure, not to replace them, this isn't the Soviet Union, but to assure that the private sector isn't the only option on the table, because that we know that for years, and this is what Mexicans lived through for years, they had low wages, but they also had to pay high prices because there was no real competition versus the private sector, whose only, and justifiable, that's why they exist, their only reason for existing is the profit motive.
Well, it all sounds fantastic, and I just struggle to. I mean, I suppose when your rating is that high, it's hard to find something to. But how about I ask this question: where do you both think? What's the biggest mistake you think Sheinbaum has done so far in her presidency?
So I think this is the biggest issue for the Americans as well, which is to win. It wasn't as clear that they'd be this popular or this powerful early on, because obviously they can't see the future. So to win a lot of these elections, they have made deals with some pretty terrible people, and those chickens are coming home to roost. The fact that Americans have basically blocked a good chunk of Morena governors from entering the US because of suspicions of working with drug cartels is incredibly worrying and could really undermine all of Claudia Sheinbaum's project. Corruption, I think that was one of the questions at the beginning. Corruption is by far the biggest issue that threatens to destroy everything that Claudia Sheinbaum has built. And you can see that she's very aware of it, because even though she's reticent because of sovereignty to hand over her own people to the United States, she's also closed herself off. That's one of the biggest issues with this government. Very few people hold all the power, and that has a lot to do with the fact that she doesn't trust a lot of the people within her own government. Just recently, we discovered that the military branch, the Navy, that is in charge of all the ports of entry into Mexico, they just discovered probably the biggest corruption scandal in Mexican history because of the fact that they were scooping oil and taxes off the top and pocketing it.
I would say as well, it's a matter of national political alliances. Some partners to win the elections, either at the federal level, state level, or locally, they are probably not the nicest or the best people. For many reasons. No?
Can you give an example?
Elaborate on that,
Yeah, like for instance, at the municipal level, sometimes the party decides to ally with some or to accept the general support of some economic dodgy actor or clearly criminals. That is a problem. That should be cut. And this happens also in the state level. I wouldn't say that happens in the federal level, but at least in municipal and state level, this happens. So, as at the beginning I was saying, it's good that Mexico is taking a pragmatic approach in the relation to the US. Maybe in the case of the national and subnational level, this pragmatism went already too long, too far away.
Got it. Well, at this point, I think maybe it would be a good time to go back to our original poll, I think, just to review some of the things you talk about corruption. So, Jared, if you want to pull it up and see what our audience had to say about it.
Yeah, exactly. Keeping in mind, Alex saying corruption's by far the biggest issue that's threatening to undo what Sheinbaum has built up, and we'll see if our audience agrees with him. At the moment, remember, we were asking you, what do you think Mexico's most pressing challenge is? Drugs and organised crime is actually the biggest issue. And then we have a tie between Donald Trump's trade policies and corruption. So a lot of people are thinking that corruption comes slightly under drugs and organised crime. At the very bottom, we have poverty reduction. So some interesting results, but we do have a tie among our audience between trade and corruption.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Any final thoughts from both of you? Thank you so much for joining us. And we've run over the hour, which I wasn't sure, which is a good sign that we're having a good, productive conversation. But what would you want to leave people tuning in with?
I would say a couple of months ago, maybe for the people who are following a bit what is happening in Germany, they know Jan Böhmermann, very famous
comedian,
comedian, TV anchor, and he made a program about how little the Germans know about neighbors. He has also some Polish origin. So he was making a lot of statements about how little it's known about Poland. It happens the same with Mexico and the US. So my invitation is, let's try to know more about this, not only follow what is being said on X or other social truth or whatever the name of this social media is, and try to look to other sources. Let's discuss more about what is happening, because if you don't name it, it doesn't exist. It's quite performative. So we need to speak about these things. And thank you for deciding to dedicate this program to Mexico and for the invite.
Thank you. Alex.
I'd like to emphasize what Tita Wen said, a really important point, which is it's really important for people to understand, global politics, but I think it's particularly important for them to understand Mexican politics and the role it plays in the global economy. Even if you're not American, even if you're a German, I think it's essential, not only because of how important Mexico is on the world stage, but also because at the moment we have one of the most interesting and innovative and sophisticated governments on earth, with enormous issues, so sophistication in crime sometimes, but also sophistication in green industrial policy, in industrial policy generally, in how you deal with a global hegemon that has gone slightly wrong. I would throw my hat in the ring and say, if you needed to find out about it in English, Access Ramp into Mexico is the Mexico Political Economist. So do subscribe if you are at all inclined.
And now this discussion on News Desk as well.
Of course.
Absolutely. Well, Zira Juan Villamar, thank you so much for joining us in the studio, and Alex Gonzalez Omarad, the Mexico Political Economist Substack. Thank you so much to both of you for educating us. It was a fantastic conversation, and I hope that this will not be the last discussion we have on Mexico at News Desk. And for those joining us in the chat online, thank you. Thank you for your comments. As always, a smart bunch, a nerdy bunch, can I say? And I mean that in the best way possible.
That's a compliment. We're back again next week, as always, and you will know what the theme is for next week 24 hours in advance. So on the Tuesday, you should be able to find our community post to see what it is that we're going to be discussing.
That's it for now. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
See you next time. Bye.